The day we buried Laura, the wind in Dallas felt wrong. Not cold, not warm, just empty. People kept telling me grief comes in waves. They were wrong. Grief is not a wave. It is a weight. It settles into your bones and refuses to move. It makes every handshake feel like an intrusion, every condolence sound rehearsed. I stood beside the coffin while the priest spoke about eternity, forgiveness, reunion. Words meant to comfort. Words that floated uselessly above the soil. Laura's children stood across from me. Her son wouldn't meet my eyes. Her daughter stared straight ahead as if I were invisible. I had raised them for 14 years, paid for their schools, covered braces, tutors, summer camps. I had signed every check without hesitation. But in that moment I was already outside the circle. Richard Hayes waited until the dirt was almost settled before he approached. He didn't hug me. He didn't say, "I'm sorry for your loss." He said, "We need to talk about the assets." Assets. His daughter was in the ground and he was calculating square footage. 3 days later, he walked into my office downtown. The office I had built from nothing but a folding table and borrowed equipment. The skyline reflected behind him in the glass walls. He looked comfortable there, as if it already belonged to him. He didn't sit. "The house, the company, all of it is mine," he said plainly. No tremor, no shame. "You get nothing. Nothing." He said it like a verdict. I watched him carefully. His tie was perfectly straight, his hands steady. He had rehearsed this moment. He had been waiting for it, maybe even longer than Laura's illness. "You look exhausted," he added. "You're not in a state to manage this properly. It's better this way. Better this way." He thought I was broken. He thought grief had made me weak. My attorney, Mark, called within the hour. He had already reviewed the will. There had been amendments during Laura's final months. Technical shifts. Controlling interests realigned. Richard positioned as trustee over substantial portions of the estate, including majority control of the operating company. "We can challenge this," Mark insisted. "There are grounds. Undue influence. Timing. Capacity. We can drag this through probate court for years." I stared at the blueprint pinned to my wall. A commercial complex we had nearly finished before Laura's condition worsened. "Let him take it," I said. Mark went silent. "You're grieving," he replied carefully. "No," I answered. "I'm thinking." Because what Richard didn't know, what no one knew, was that I had spent years preparing for this exact possibility. Not because I distrusted Laura, because I distrusted her father. The first time he ever mentioned protecting family interests was 10 years ago. He had asked about equity structures over Thanksgiving dinner casually between bites of turkey. The children were teenagers then, already testing boundaries, already reminding me in subtle ways that I wasn't their biological father. "You've done well," Richard had said that night. "But blood matters in the long run. Blood matters." It wasn't advice. It was a warning. From that day forward, I moved carefully. Quietly, I separated liability from ownership. Created a management entity registered in Colorado under my sole control. Transferred intellectual property, licensing agreements, brand trademarks, and long-term client contracts into that entity through perfectly legal restructurings. Equipment leases were reassigned. Vendor relationships rewritten. Retainers redirected. On paper, the Texas operating company remained profitable. In reality, it was a shell. I did it gradually, over 3 years. Never in large moves. Never in ways that would raise suspicion. I told myself it was strategic growth, risk mitigation, expansion. But beneath the business language, there was another truth. I had seen how Laura's children looked at me when their biological father resurfaced every Christmas with expensive gifts and loud promises. I had seen how Richard's presence shifted the air in the room. I was tolerated, never embraced. I carried the family financially. I worked weekends. I missed vacations to secure contracts. When Laura fell ill, I covered hospital bills insurance refused to touch. And still, in subtle ways, I remained temporary. So I built something that couldn't be taken from me by a signature on a deathbed. When word spread that I wasn't contesting the will, People reacted exactly as I expected. Friends said I was betraying Laura's memory by letting her father steal everything. Employees avoided direct eye contact. I overheard whispers in the break room. He's folding. He doesn't have the fight in him. Even Laura's children looked at me differently, not with grief but with disappointment, as if I had confirmed what they'd always suspected, that I wasn't strong enough to protect what their mother had helped build. They didn't know the truth. Richard began making appearances at the office, touring departments, asking accounting for reports, discussing transition strategy. He shook hands like a conqueror. He even measured the executive chair in my office with his eyes. And I let him. I signed preliminary transfer documents without argument. I answered questions politely. I gave no resistance. My silence made him bold. Victory intoxicates careless men. At night, alone in the house Laura and I had shared, I walked through rooms that no longer felt like mine. Her scent had faded, her laughter gone. Her children spoke to me through clipped sentences and closed doors. I realized something cold and undeniable. I had been a provider, not a pillar. And now that the legal ground shifted, they were watching to see whether I would crumble. I didn't crumble. I waited, because sometimes the strongest move a man can make is stepping aside and allowing someone else to overreach. Richard thought he was seizing control. In reality, he was stepping into a structure whose foundation had already been removed. He just didn't know it yet. And when he finally would, it wouldn't require shouting. It wouldn't require revenge. It would require nothing more than his own signature. Tell me something. If you saw the trap forming years in advance, if you knew the people under your roof would never truly see you as their own, would you have prepared the same way? Or would you have trusted love to protect you? Richard didn't wait for ink to dry before celebrating. Grief had barely finished echoing through the church when he began rewriting history. He called a meeting at the office, my office, under the banner of stability. Employees gathered in the conference room I had designed myself, the long walnut table I had paid for when cash flow was still tight and risk felt personal. I stood at the back wall. He stood at the head. He cleared his throat like a man assuming command of a ship he believed abandoned. As many of you know, he began, folding his hands neatly, I now control the majority interest in the company. Michael has decided not to contest the transition. We will be moving forward under new leadership. New leadership. He said it without looking at me. I watched faces around the table. Confusion, pity, calculation. Some of them had been with me since the beginning, when we were 2 trucks and a rented storage unit. They had seen me bleed for contracts, fight through recessions, mortgage my own future to keep payroll intact. Now they looked at me like a man who had surrendered. Richard continued outlining strategic adjustments, liquidation of certain equipment, downsizing inefficient divisions, reviewing client lists for profitability. He spoke as if he understood the machinery beneath the surface. He didn't. He was reading numbers from reports that no longer meant what they appeared to mean. He thought he was inheriting a thriving organism. He was stepping into a body whose vital organs had already been relocated. That afternoon he asked for keys, warehouse keys, fleet access, administrative passwords. I handed them over without hesitation. He smiled then, the kind of smile a man gives when he believes the opponent has conceded. Wise decision, he murmured quietly as others filed out. You don't have the appetite for a legal war right now. He mistook restraint for weakness. That was his second mistake. The following weeks became theater. Richard began telling suppliers that the company was entering a new era. He hinted at expansion, at modernization. He ordered new executive furniture before understanding the depreciation schedule of the old. He announced publicly that he was reviewing options to liquidate certain assets to increase liquidity. Liquidity. He didn't realize most of the profitable long-term contracts were no longer tied to the Texas entity he controlled. They belonged to the Colorado management firm Hayes Strategic Operations, LLC. My firm, registered 3 years earlier. Quietly, every high-margin client had signed updated service agreements under that umbrella. The intellectual property, proprietary scheduling software, vendor networks, exclusive material sourcing agreements, had been transferred legally during a structural optimization phase. All documented, all clean, all invisible to anyone who hadn't read the filings carefully. Richard never read carefully. He read confidently. There's a difference. The final court hearing arrived faster than he expected. Probate formalities, transfer of controlling interest, formal recognition of estate execution. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, impersonal. Mark sat beside me, expression unreadable. "You're certain?" he asked one last time. "I am," I replied. Across the aisle, Richard adjusted his cufflinks. His attorney shuffled papers with rehearsed ease. The judge asked procedural questions. Assets were listed, holdings acknowledged. When it came time for me to sign over the remaining formal ownership rights, I did so without resistance. Pen steady, signature clean. Richard exhaled slowly, as if concluding a long chess match. He leaned back in his chair. Victory. Then something shifted. His attorney, mid-review of supplementary documents, paused. Brows furrowed. Pages flipped backward. Forward again. His posture changed first. Then his complexion. Richard noticed. "What is it?" he whispered sharply. The attorney leaned closer, voice low but urgent. "These filings, the operational contracts, the intellectual property registrations." Richard frowned. "What about them? They're not held by this entity anymore." Silence. The kind that expands. The attorney continued flipping through documents, corporate restructuring filings from 3 years prior, transfer agreements, licensing amendments, client reassignment notices acknowledged and executed. All major revenue-generating contracts were assigned to Hayes Strategic Operations, LLC, registered in Colorado. Sole managing member, Michael. Richard's head turned slowly toward me. The smile evaporated. "What is he talking about?" Richard demanded. I met his eyes for the first time that morning. "Risk management," I said calmly. The judge cleared his throat, uninterested in family drama. "Are there any disputes regarding the formal transfer as presented?" Richard's attorney swallowed. "No, Your Honor. The transfer of the Texas entity is valid." Valid. The shell was his. The substance was not. Richard's breathing grew heavier. "This is manipulation," he hissed toward me. "You stripped it." "No," I replied evenly. "I restructured it. Everything had been legal, documented, transparent in filings. No fraud, no concealment. Simply strategy executed before illness became terminal, before intentions sharpened. He had assumed control of physical assets, a building, depreciating equipment, outstanding liabilities. What he did not control were the licensing rights required to use the brand name in new contracts. He did not control the management agreements tied to major clients. He did not control the intellectual property necessary to execute proprietary bids. The revenue engine was elsewhere, and it had been for years. The hearing concluded quickly after that. On paper, Richard Hayes owned the Texas company. In reality, he owned obligations. As we exited the courthouse, reporters, tipped off by his own earlier announcements, waited for comment. He had bragged about consolidation, about stepping in to protect his daughter's legacy. Now cameras hovered. He avoided them. I did not stop either. In the parking lot, he confronted me. "You planned this," he said, voice trembling with something between rage and disbelief. "I prepared," I answered. "You knew she was dying." I held his gaze. "I knew you." His face reddened. "You've stolen from her estate." "No," I said quietly. "I moved what I built." There's a difference between theft and foresight. He climbed into his car without another word. By the time he understood the full scope, the liabilities attached to payroll, pending lawsuits tied to projects already transferred, equipment leases exceeding current cash flow, it was too late. He had publicly declared ownership. He had already begun making decisions based on assumptions that no longer applied. And the employees? They would soon learn where their real contracts were held. Tell me something. When a man reaches for power without understanding the structure beneath it, does he deserve mercy when the foundation collapses under his weight? Richard didn't understand immediately. Men like him rarely do. For the first 48 hours after the hearing, he continued acting as if nothing fundamental had changed. He occupied my former office, replaced the nameplate on the desk, sent company-wide emails announcing operational review initiatives. He even scheduled a celebratory dinner with a handful of long-standing suppliers. Victory has momentum, carries a man forward before reality has time to catch him. But numbers don't lie forever. The first tremor came from payroll. His new accounting review revealed something he hadn't expected. Projected cash flow didn't align with upcoming obligations. Major revenue deposits, the ones he assumed were arriving at the end of the quarter, were absent. He called the bank. The bank confirmed what the filings already showed. Those receivables were payable to Hayes Strategic Operations, LLC, not to the Texas entity he now controlled. I was in Denver when his first message arrived. Short, contained, tempting calm. We need to discuss certain discrepancies in billing allocations. Discrepancies. I didn't answer. The second message was less composed. This restructuring was not disclosed transparently. I expect clarification immediately. Clarification. I waited. Then came the call. He didn't bother with pleasantries. You drained it, he said. No, I replied. You inherited it. Heavy breathing on the other end. The contracts, he continued, struggling to control his tone. You transferred them under the guise of expansion. They were reassigned during strategic diversification, I said. 3 years ago, properly filed, fully disclosed in annual reports. You concealed the impact. I anticipated risk. Silence. Then anger. You planned to leave Laura with nothing. The accusation was predictable. Emotional. Desperate. I planned to protect what I built, I said calmly. From instability. He understood the implication. From him. Over the next week, his illusion collapsed in layers. Equipment leases exceeded operating income. The warehouse property carried maintenance liabilities he had never examined closely. Ongoing litigation from 2 incomplete municipal projects remained attached to the Texas entity. He had assumed he was acquiring an empire. He had acquired exposure. He attempted intimidation next. Letters from his attorney arrived, alleging breach of fiduciary duty, misrepresentation, unfair asset stripping. Each one crafted to sound threatening. Each one hollow. Mark handled the responses with surgical precision. Every transfer had documentation. Every client reassignment carried signed acknowledgement. Intellectual property filings were time-stamped and compliant with state and federal regulations. Nothing illegal. Nothing reversible. Richard escalated to personal confrontation. He flew to Denver without warning and appeared at the temporary office space I had leased months earlier in anticipation of relocation. He looked smaller there, out of jurisdiction. You will reconsider this, he said the moment the door closed behind him. You will reintegrate the contracts into the Texas company. No, I answered. You're sabotaging Laura's legacy. I held his stare. Laura's legacy was not you. The words hit harder than I intended. For a moment, grief cracked through his anger, but pride sealed it quickly. You think this makes you strong? He asked bitterly. No, I said. It makes me solvent. He tried persuasion next. We can renegotiate equity, he offered. Shared management. Public reconciliation. You restore operational revenue. I stabilize liabilities. We both benefit. I almost admired the pivot, but I shook my head. You didn't want partnership, I reminded him. You wanted control. His jaw tightened. You could have fought the will, he said. You chose silence. That was deception. No, I replied. That was strategy. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You think you've won. I considered that carefully. I think you got exactly what you asked for. The Texas company continued deteriorating under his oversight. Vendors, Sensing instability, tightened credit terms. Employees began receiving offers from competitors, some quietly approached by me. Not poaching. Opportunity. I never instructed anyone to leave, but I made it known that Hayes' strategic operations was expanding. People choose stability over pride. Within 3 months, half the senior project managers had transferred to the Colorado entity. Legally, voluntarily, Richard attempted one final maneuver. He filed a motion alleging that the restructuring constituted constructive fraud against the estate. The hearing was brief. Documentation prevailed. Intent, when supported by compliance, is not fraud. It is foresight. When the motion was dismissed, something in him shifted permanently. The calls stopped. The letters ceased. Publicly, he maintained composure. Privately, he was hemorrhaging influence. He had inherited a title. I had retained the engine. An engine's determined direction. One evening, months after the courthouse confrontation, he sent a final message. "You've destroyed the company." I read it twice before responding. No, I relocated it. There is a difference between destruction and displacement. He never replied. By the end of the fiscal year, the Texas entity entered controlled liquidation. Asset sales covered outstanding liabilities, but nothing substantial remained. The warehouse was sold. The office lease terminated. The executive chair he had ordered sat and used in an empty room for weeks before being auctioned. In Denver, operations expanded quietly. Contracts renewed under the Colorado umbrella. New municipal bids secured. Brand presence rebuilt without spectacle. I didn't gloat. I didn't publish statements. I didn't correct rumors. Silence remained my ally. But sometimes, late at night, I replayed the moment in the courtroom. His smile fading as pages turned pale in his attorney's hands. Victory is loud when it's assumed. Defeat is quiet when it's understood. Tell me something. If a man tries to erase you from what you built, and you respond not with fury, but with preparation, is that revenge? Or is it simply survival? The silence after collapse is different from the silence before it. Before, it is tension. After, it is consequence. By the time the Texas entity entered controlled liquidation, Richard had stopped pretending. The bravado was gone. The public confidence dissolved into tightly worded statements about market realignment and strategic miscalculations. He never admitted defeat. He didn't need to. The numbers did it for him. The warehouse was the first to go. An industrial shell filled with equipment he had once walked through like a conqueror. Auctioneers moved methodically through rows of depreciated machinery. Forklifts, scaffolding, concrete mixers. Sold at fractions of what he believed they were worth. I didn't attend. I didn't need the spectacle. Next came the office lease termination. The building manager called me out of habit before realizing my name was no longer on the primary control documents. Richard had to sign the release himself. I imagined him sitting in the executive chair he had ordered, staring at walls that once carried my plans, now bare. Control is intoxicating. Responsibility is sobering. In Denver, I kept everything quiet. Hayes' strategic operations didn't announce expansion with fanfare. No press releases. No dramatic declarations. We secured contracts the same way I always had, through performance, reliability, delivery. Clients followed stability. Employees followed structure. Within 6 months, the Colorado entity had absorbed nearly all viable revenue streams that once flowed through Texas. Not by force, by gravity. Stability attracts. Chaos repels. Laura's children called me once during that period. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't apologetic. It was transactional. They had begun to understand what their grandfather had done, and what he had failed to do. Their trust in him thinned quickly when paychecks from the estate distributions shrank. "You could have fought for more," her son said over the phone. There was accusation in his voice. "I didn't need to," I answered. "You let him take everything." "No," I corrected. "I let him take what he understood." Silence on the line. They never truly knew the full structure of what I had built. To them, I was the man who stepped aside. The man who didn't wage war publicly. They mistook composure for surrender. They always had. Richard tried one final attempt at leverage months later. Private meeting request. Neutral ground. A downtown Dallas restaurant where the lighting was low and the music discreet. He looked older. Not physically, but internally. Like a man who had calculated too late. "We can still merge," he said after formalities dissolved. "There's no benefit in maintaining two fractured legacies." Legacies. The word lingered. "There aren't two," I replied. He stiffened. "You're arrogant." "No," I said calmly. "I'm separate." He studied me carefully. "You don't feel anything about how this unfolded?" The question surprised me. "I feel grief," I said honestly. "For Laura. For what illness does to families. But not for business decisions." He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "You've cost me everything." I shook my head slowly. "You cost yourself." That was the truth he couldn't accept. He believed ownership was possession. He believed signatures were strength. He never understood infrastructure. Infrastructure is invisible until removed. The house Laura and I had lived in was sold shortly after liquidation proceedings stabilized. I handled that personally. Quietly. No ceremony. No nostalgia tours. Empty rooms echo differently when memory no longer anchors them. I walked through the master bedroom one last time. The walls still faintly held the indentation where her headboard rested. The closet half empty. The air sterile. I didn't feel triumph. I felt closure. I relocated permanently to Denver soon after. Expanded the office. Hired selectively. Reinforced systems. Structured governance to prevent future vulnerability. Control isn't about domination. It's about insulation. By the time Richard fully understood the scope of what he had lost, not just property but influence, the public narrative had already settled. The Texas company was a cautionary tale. The Colorado firm was the continuation. He had possession. I had continuity. There is a difference. People sometimes ask if I regret not fighting publicly, not dragging him through headlines, not exposing the maneuvering during Laura's illness. I don't. Public war feeds ego. Private preparation feeds survival. The best victories are the ones your opponent doesn't recognize until it's irreversible. Richard believed I was broken. He believed grief made me fragile. He believed silence meant weakness. He was wrong on all counts. Sometimes the strongest move a man can make is allowing someone to believe they have already won. Because once they relax, once they celebrate, once they announce triumph, they stop looking beneath the surface. And beneath the surface is where foundations live. I never raised my voice. I never threatened. I never retaliated emotionally. I simply allowed him to take exactly what he demanded. Nothing more. Nothing less. Now tell me something. If someone stands in your office in your grief and tells you that you are entitled to nothing, do you fight loudly to prove them wrong? Or do you step aside, let them claim the throne, and watch as it collapses under its own weight? Was I ruthless? Or was I the only one in the room thinking long-term?